And welcome to the third meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Parliament is in recess, but due to the budget timescales this year, we've had to arrange this meeting this week. And I'm very grateful to the clerks and officials of the Parliament for making this possible, and to members for rearranging their diaries. We have apologies this morning from our convener, Bruce Crawford, and from Alexander Burnett, Alec Rowley, and John Mason. George Adam and Sarah Boyack are attending as substitute members, and I welcome them to this meeting. Our first agenda item this morning, apart from me to remind you to please put your mobile phones in a manner that will not interfere with our proceedings, is to decide whether to take any consideration of future draft reports on the Scottish Government's budget 2020 to 2021 in private. Are members agreed? Yes, members are agreed. Thank you very much. The second item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Scottish Government's budget for 2020 to 21, first from the Scottish Fiscal Commission and then later this morning from the Minister for Public Finance. And we're joined for this first session by Dame Susan Rice, the Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, by John Ireland, its Chief Executive, and by Commissioners Professors Francis Breeden, David Ulf and Alistair Smith. Welcome to all of you this morning, and I invite Dame Susan to make what I understand are going to be some very brief opening remarks before we move to questions. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Convener. I've promised 2 minutes, so you can all look at your watches. And thank you for asking us to give evidence. As I'm sure you'll all have pored over the budget and our forecast report, I shall simply highlight the points we think are most important. The upcoming budget now reflects nearly all the implications of the fiscal framework, with some pretty big elements kicking in this year. We note that this is the first time an income tax reconciliation in relation to the 2017-18 tax year has had to be factored into the budget. The government intends to borrow as it can to cover this shortfall. Next tax year, however, the income tax reconciliation is estimated to be more than twice as high. With the government borrowing this year and reserves low, we signal the need to plan early for how to meet that future shortfall. The budget also reflects the cost of the Scottish Government taking control of all devolved social security benefits, which adds in excess of £3 billion, or about 10%, to resource expenditure. There's less change due to tax policy, which increases revenues by a bit over £50 million, mainly due to freezing the higher rate threshold for income tax. As with our economy forecast, which continues to assume a smooth transition to a trade agreement by the end of the year, with delays seen as a downside risk. As all these moving parts kick in, the government will need to monitor the budget continuously throughout the year. Finally, we believe the factors I've just run through will have the greater impact on the budget than its timing before the UK budget this year, unless there are significant policy changes to come. We should all take stock again at the time of the MTFS, when a lot more will be clear. And indeed, it might also be helpful if the Parliament, the government, and us perhaps got together to think through how the process should be managed if the UK budget timetable were to change over the longer term. But for now, we're happy to answer questions on the report. Thank you.
Well, that was brief. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you for those opening remarks. I'm going to start with growth and growth forecasts. And your economic growth forecasts anticipate subdued economic growth for the next 5 years for Scotland. And while the various forecasts for the UK aren't much higher, they are still more optimistic. So 2 questions about this, if I may. First, what are your main reasons for being a bit more pessimistic with regard to Scotland than most of the UK forecasts are for the United Kingdom? And what are the main policy areas which you think we should be focusing on in this budget to address this?
Who wants to kick that off? Francis, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the recent history, Scottish productivity growth has been somewhat weaker than that in the rest of the UK, although we think that's a relatively temporary effect, and that's really the starting off point for our slightly weaker position for growth in Scotland. But I think it's fair to say that when we do our forecast, we don't think of it as a sort of relative to the UK. I mean, we're doing these as independent focus of Scotland. But if I were to think about what the key issue is, I think it is that productivity growth issue, which obviously is an important policy issue, and things like public investment and other public interventions can help in that long run productivity story.
I'm happy to add one thought to that, which is, Convener, your question was what should be done in the budget about that. I think the implication of what Francis has said is that it's perhaps not primarily a budget issue. You can think of the productivity issue as what do we need to do to get more high quality, high paying jobs in the Scottish economy. And that's fundamentally not an issue that can be driven by the budget. There are other areas of public policy that should probably be the main area of focus. If that is the question, and indeed I agree with you, it's a very important question for the Scottish economy, but it's not primarily a budget question.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that before we move on? One element of growth is, and one element of your forecasts pertains to earnings. So perhaps we can, and a number of members want to ask quite detailed questions about earnings growth. Let me start with this. Your latest set of forecasts with regard to earnings growth in Scotland continue to exceed earlier expectations, and this has resulted in an upwards revision of, I think, 273 million to your income tax forecast for 2020-2021. And you're also forecasting a year-on-year increase of around 6% in income tax revenues for the same year, 2020-2021. But Spice have told us that despite this more optimistic outlook and higher taxes in Scotland, the benefit to the Scottish budget will be just £46 million. So why, given the more positive outlook and an increased tax burden for Scottish taxpayers of around £650 million, will public finances increase by less than 1/10 of that amount?
Good, perhaps.
Yeah. John,
Yeah,
would you like to start off? Yeah.
I think the way of looking through this is to think exactly how the split in how our forecast has changed from the last budget forecast. And it's true that the economy and earnings have added about £320 million to the forecast, but there are a number of other things which are sort of pulling it down in a different direction. It's certainly true that our recosting of UK government policy around pensions auto-enrolment has brought down our income tax forecast by 120 million, so that's one of the countervening factors. We also have outturn data for 2017-18, which has brought down the forecast by a further 110 million. And this is all shown in a table in the report, which we can let you have. But basically, there are a number of sort of factors which are pulling down the forecast, as well as the sort of the increase due to earnings and the increase due to the government's policy.
Sorry, that was a sudden stop.
It was a sudden stop because I got to the end of what I was going to say.
Tom.
One question on growth. There's a difference between Scotland and rest of the UK, but on a per capita basis that difference is reduced. Why is that?
It's when the productivity growth between, which is the real driver of this in a sense, is reasonably similar to that of the rest of the UK. It's when you start adding things like population growth in that the disparities come. And so I think it's been fair to say over the past that although productivity growth in Scotland and the UK have been in a similar sort of space, so that's a per capita growth, that things like population growth and employment growth have been greater in the rest of the UK than have been in Scotland, and that explains that disparity.
Can you just explain in a way that, my constituents and people in Scotland would understand quite clearly how population growth is benefiting the rest of the UK to have increased growth in a way at Scotland?
Well, the more people who live in the country, so if your productivity is exactly the same in Scotland than the rest of the UK, if there are more people, and those number of people are growing more rapidly in the rest of the UK than it is in Scotland, then obviously the size of the total cake is growing more in the rest of the UK than it is in Scotland.
So this difference is really just almost solely explained by differences in population?
It's a little bit about labour market participation, so of the population who works, and it's a little bit, and a lot of it is down to differential population growth, yes. So,
and what about the per capita working age population? Am I correct in understanding that the difference almost disappears entirely between Scotland and the rest of the UK?
Well, that's it, in the sense that I said that productivity, which is output output per person employed, roughly, which you can roughly approximate by the working age population. So that's much more equal between the two parts of the UK. But the difference, in a sense, is the population.
Okay, but in Scotland's had this historic, long-standing issue with population growth. It's structural. Sorry, were you wanting in, Professor Smith? No. So I'm just trying to understand, in terms of policy, because the question is about what policies could be used to address the issue of differentiation and growth between Scotland and the rest of the UK. I'm understanding it's about population growth would be one of the key areas that has to be addressed to address this issue of difference in GDP.
So population growth is important for sure, and it's also the age distribution. So if there are more, which I think there are in Scotland, more older people who are not in the working age band, then obviously that's going to cause a difference as well. But you're right, it's you know, looking at population is a very important policy factor.
So just so I understand you entirely, that the key policy issue to address for Scotland to match the growth rates of the rest of the UK is not just to increase the population, but to increase the working age population. And that's overwhelmingly the key policy issue. Yeah.
In a sense, it's a very sort of arithmetic thing, yes, and that's the part of the sum you need to think about, yes.
I appreciate it's very crucial. There's a number of factors, birth rate, inward migration, etc.
I think it's also fair to add that the growth of productivity per head in both Scotland and the rest of the UK is actually very disappointing. So for both regions, there's an issue about productivity per head, I think saying population growth is the whole issue. I think slightly sweeps under the carpet the fact that this very disappointing productivity growth really actually throughout the developed world has been a really difficult issue for economists to deal with for a number of years now.
I appreciate it. It's really helpful to kind of clarify my understanding of it's actually population growth is the main driver behind this divergence in economic performance. And obviously, the kind of key levers over population growth don't rest at this Parliament, the rest at Westminster.
Yeah. But just to reinforce what Francis said, the difference in population growth or the growth of the working population may be the main difference between Scotland and the rest of the UK. But arguably the key economic issue is productivity, which, as Francis said, is common to both Scotland and England. I understand it's interesting to look at the difference between Scotland and England, but that shouldn't distract you too much from the fact that it's actually the productivity number where both parts of the UK have a problem by past historical standards.
Okay. Members who want to come in on this space. Murdo first, and then Gordon, and then Neil. Murdo.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Just in this area, we saw labour market statistics, the most recent set, which came out, I think, about 3 weeks ago, which showed that Scottish unemployment rate is more or less equivalent to the UK unemployment rate, and in fact, tends to track it quite closely, sometimes slightly higher, sometimes slightly lower. But the Scottish employment rate is substantially lower than the UK employment rate, and the gap is now 2%, which is the highest it's been for 2 decades. So I suppose my question is the lower employment rate in Scotland a cause or a symptom of lower economic growth, or a bit of both?
That's hard to answer. I think, participation, clearly, you're right. I mean, it's both sides. That you're willing to participate. Partly depends on what you'll get if you do participate. So there's that aspect. And the participation rate, I mean, I think there's also the issue about, the demographics underlying that as well. So, although this is participation of the working age population. Yep. So, yes, I think, all I can say is I think you're right that there's push and pull factors as to people choosing to participate, the low participation being a contributor to low growth and the low growth being a contributor to low participation.
So,
that is that low levels of participation will show up, other things being equal, in lower levels of GDP. If you want to use this to account for growth, it's going to be more about getting a growing level of people participating in the labour market. So it's the rate of change of participation that's going to matter more for growth.
Okay, thank you.
And thing, sorry, which is just to caution about looking at that very last observation on employment, because if my memory is correct, it dipped down quite a lot and was out of trend with previous employment figures.
Okay. That given, I mean, the employment rate in Scotland historically has lagged the UK average. if we in Scotland were able to have an employment rate that matched the UK average, what impact would that have on our economic growth and on our income tax receipts?
It would be a one-off in the sense that, you know, as David was saying, if you think about growth, it's the increasing participation rather than the level that matters. So I think you get a temporary boost to growth. And unless John has some numbers at his fingertips, I couldn't give you a figure for that. But it would be just be a temporary boost to growth as the participation rate then matched the rest of the UK, and then the growth rates would go on as before.
Raise income tax levels. And again, to the extent you can drive a growth in participation, that will make income tax rates grow faster.
And if you want hard numbers, if you look at the table I was referring to at the start of the session, the change in income tax revenue from our previous budget forecast, next financial year, the employment data knocked 48 million off our forecast of income tax.
Right.
So you can see that's roughly equivalent to the increase in income tax revenue from the government's policy.
Okay, thank you. So okay. So, I mean, to summarise, increasing the number of people actively in the workplace would increase income tax revenues across Scotland and be a benefit to the Scottish budget. Yeah. You're nodding. That's fine.
We can say yes.
Yes, we're all saying yes.
The official report can't pick you up if you nod, you see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. I know you've got questions on tax reconciliation. I'll come back to that in a little while, but I want to bring Gordon and Neil in on this question first. So, Gordon.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Your forecast for Scottish earnings growth is revised up for every year of the forecast. Can you give us some background to the reason for that increasing? And also, in terms of what assumptions have you made about the UK government's budget in terms of tax, and what impact could that have on the overall tax take that we've talked about, this 46 billion?
So, well, on the earnings growth, I think, you know, it's been a long-running puzzle in the sense that we've had this very low level of unemployment, and it hasn't been pushing through into higher earnings. And I think for, you know, all forecasters have been slightly struggling to understand why we haven't had stronger earning growth in the face of such low unemployment. And I think what we've seen now, and in the latest data, is that earnings growth is beginning. You know, the tight conditions of the labour market are finally beginning to come through. So in our forecast, we've really taken the position that you know, this is the moment. You know, the unemployment rate has now got to the point where the labour market is genuinely tight, and therefore earnings will begin to push up as those scarce resources are bid up in price. In terms of the impact of tax changes and spending changes in the UK, we've certainly factored those into the forecasts, but they don't make a lot of difference to our forecast of the Scottish economy. So they're a relatively minor factor. So if that was particularly the issue we're picking up.
I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
But the latest forecast implies that Scottish earnings growth will match the UK's from 2020. Yeah. Will that make much of a difference, or you know, if it continues to match the UK growth earnings? I mean, how would that impact?
Yeah, so that has a big impact on income tax revenue. So that earnings growth is a big driver of tax revenue. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And would that see as any change in the profile at the rate that people pay income tax in terms of higher earners or the top rate?
Yeah, so if obviously it depends what happens to the thresholds as well, but for a given set of thresholds, faster earnings growth will push more and more people into higher tax bands. So so in a sense, for a given percentage growth in earnings, you'll get a higher percentage growth in tax revenue out of it. So it is a very important aspect of the forecast.
And has that been reflected in the forecast?
Yes, yeah.
What other changes have happened in forecasts that have been produced by the SFC in terms of the basis or the amount of certainty or the margin of error within? What changes have happened recently?
Yeah, well, as you know, are you interested in the process or in
process?
The process. So, as you know, this has been a slightly unusual round, and I think what we've done that is unusual is we normally have a UK forecast from the OBR that then we can bring that into our Scottish forecast, and This time around, we've used a mixture of, we brought another forecast in for the UK sort of macro determinants, which is one by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which replaces the OBR one that is out of date. But we're also using some of those older OBR forecasts for things that we can't pick up from that. So I think it's been a slightly, well, obviously for us, it's been quite a different procedure. And inevitably, I think that does mean it's been, there's a bit more uncertainty than we would normally have. I can't quantify how big that, how big that uncertainty is, but it's definitely the case that it is the mismatch of a UK fiscal forecast with ours just makes it a slightly more complicated process. But I think we're pretty happy with the use of another forecaster to help deal with that issue on the macro side has actually been relatively smooth and looks like it's worked well as a procedure. So we're happy with it. As a replacement, it's not the ideal, but it's one that's worked relatively well.
If this is going to be the norm moving forward, that the Scottish budget has to be produced before the UK budget, and the OBR figures you're using is, what was it, last March or something like that?
Well, it's a mix, but yes.
Yeah, but what needs to change to increase the level of certainty?
Yeah, well, I think for us, I mean, in a sense, it's not so much the budget; it's the existence of an OBR forecast. So I think for us, if we go to the normal situation, there's two OBR forecasts. We don't necessarily, I mean, that's for us the key for the forecasting rather than the actual time of the budget itself. So I think we can match to a different OBR forecast. Doesn't have to be the budget one, but not having an OBR forecast is, I mean, as we demonstrated, is doable, but it's not the ideal.
No. And one last point I was going to ask you was about the impact of any change to personal allowances and national insurance contributions we could potentially have on Scotland's income tax take.
I mean, if the UK change,
yes.
Yeah. So I think we obviously we just wait to see what happens in the budget to see what impact that those things have, and I think we would.
What have you reflected in your figures?
So we haven't gone into detailed policies. So we basically we have some impact of more government spending, but we haven't picked up individual policies here because at the moment, UK budget, we want those UK budget policies to be fully set out and costed. So before we introduce the individual issues, so we haven't done anything on individual measures.
Right. So there could be a substantial change to your forecast if there was a major divergence from where we currently are in terms of personal allowances and national insurance contributions.
Yes, I mean, if there was a significant change beyond what we have is in there, yes, I mean that.
But in a differential way, the personal allowance directly affects the size of the Scottish income tax base, whereas the national insurance contributions work in a much more indirect way. They affect the marginal rate in total. They don't affect the size of the Scottish tax base. So it's more of a behavioural effect. It's would probably be more muted.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much.
Neil.
Productivity has obviously been a long-term challenge which predates Brexit. Professor Smith, you said earlier that productivity wasn't primarily driven by the budget, but I would have thought that if we are going to increase employment levels and bring new jobs that will help drive forward productivity, then that is going to require fiscal stimulus and investment from government in the right areas. Is that?
Certainly fiscal stimulus can help, and investment is certainly an important part of it. But for a fiscal stimulus to be successful in generating long-term growth, the capacity of the economy to respond has got to be there.
Okay. And can I ask, in terms of productivity, what interventions have you observed from the Scottish Government in this budget that will improve productivity?
I don't think we have. We can't pin down precise. I mean, it is difficult. Sadly, there's not a sort of magic. We don't really know what the policy is that will improve this productivity story. I think we're all, it's a sort of head-scratching problem for policymakers around the world, and so you know, I'd like to be able to tell you, oh yes, policy X will solve this problem, but at the moment we don't, you know, it is unclear what policies will actually matter to deal with this productivity issue.
And do you have an assessment of how of the Scottish Government's attempts to drive forward productivity to date?
Well, I would say that for the reasons that we've already been touching on, it's not the issues that you might want to look at most closely are not the issues that are within our remit. I mean, if you're asking me as an economist, not a member of not as a member of the Fiscal Commission, what Scottish policy issues would I be looking at about that might affect productivity? I would be looking at Scottish education policy and the new Scottish National Investment Bank, but we have no role in evaluating education policy or evaluating the likely effects of the Scottish National Investment Bank. So I'm not trying to evade the issue, but I don't want to be drawn into a discussion of areas that are not our responsibility. And I'm not evading the issue of productivity, just saying primarily those are questions for areas of policy other than the areas for which we're responsible for scrutinising.
Well, thanks for your answer.
Okay, thank you. Angela.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. In your foreword, in your report, you talk about a revised protocol between yourselves and the Scottish Government based on the fact that you're keen to learn about what's worked well and what needs to improve in terms of your overall approach to forecasting. So I'm interested to know what's new in the relationship and what have you learned?
I'll kick off and then maybe, John, you could give some detail. We have a written and indeed published protocol in terms of how we work with the Scottish Government. And we review that at least once a year because we look back at how things worked the last time around and, you know, find ways to improve, whether it's the timing, the handovers, you know, who speaks to whom when and so forth. So that's an ongoing process of simply improving the way we approach that relationship. We think it has become smoother, that all parties know and understand what they need to do. At various points, but John, you may want to give some detail behind that.
Yeah, the protocol is really about sort of the engagement with the government on a sort of a day-to-day basis. And when will they give us this piece of information? When will we give them this part of this preview of the forecast? When will we hold these meetings? And it also pins down sort of interchange with ministers and things like that. So it's a very sort of this is how you do a forecast in the sense of the relationships rather than actually doing the forecast. So I think and as Susan said, we look about that each year, and if a piece of communication hasn't worked well, we sort of tweak it. A lot of the time, these revisions were about timetables and making sure that the government had enough time to think through our forecast in terms of formulating policy, but making sure that we too had enough time to think about how we made forecasts and how we responded to the government policy thinking. So that's what the protocol does. I think the other part of what we do is the forecast evaluation. So the Fiscal Commission Act requires that every year we evaluate our forecasts, which we do in September. And in terms of sort of the quality of our forecast, that exercise of evaluating our forecast is much more important than the protocol. And the other thing, as you'll be aware of, we had a big external review last year from the OECD, which again pointed to, was a very close look at all our models and how we put our forecast together. And again, there's some lessons for us in that about how we go about our business.
Okay, thank you. How well plugged in do you feel to developing social security policy? I'm not asking you to comment on social security policy, but just on the basis that understanding policy, how it's developing, has a bearing on your forecasts, I would certainly assume. So how well are you knitted into that process, given that it's not just approach that's likely to continue to be different, but the processes around developing policy for social security in Scotland is different with user panels, scrutiny panels, stakeholders, etc., etc.
So I think we are increasingly more effectively joined together. I mean, we've come together. There was a conference or seminar a few months back where we spoke, and it was all around the delivery of social security. We have a lot of connections, and we have a lot of meetings and exchanges to understand what's happening. John, do you want to, or David possibly?
Yeah, perhaps. Go
Yeah,
on.
David. Yeah.
The various rounds when we're developing our forecasts, we have meetings both with people in the Scottish Government who are responsible for policy on social security and with people from Social Security Scotland, so we actually understand some of the mechanisms by which these policies will be delivered. These are really quite important elements in our forecast for, say, the uptake of certain benefits and we do modify our assumptions on the basis of what we hear at those meetings, and those have been extremely constructive meetings.
Okay, thank you for that. You also in your report you highlight that social security spend will account for 10% of the revenue budget, coming under just under £4 billion. That it's a demand-led area, and the government has to, at the end of the day, always meet its commitments. Yet committee was briefed last week that the average forecast error on the devolved benefits is around 3.5%. And I wondered if you'd want to comment on that, given that also in your report you conceded that forecast errors were likely.
Well, they are likely, as in all forecasts, and 3.5% isn't a dreadful number, but also keep in mind that in some cases where Social Security benefits have already devolved and there are new elements that have not been delivered through the UK, the previous UK route, there's no history on which to base our forecasts. So we do the best we can with whatever information we have, but forecasts improve when you have a background of history with something like the new Scottish child payment. That's never been done before, so forecasting that is a challenge. We figure out what elements might lead to take up and therefore the cost of that, and do our best to factor that in, but there are bound to be errors in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that much of this is a new journey, and I know that you said 3.5% isn't a horrendous figure, but as it's an average, obviously it could be less, or indeed it could be much greater. So given that I think you yourself have acknowledged that there's that the volatility in the budget has increased as a result of the social security powers, but the powers to manage that volatility have remained the same. And I just wondered whether you had a view in that, and given that the fiscal framework in due course will be reviewed, at a practical level, what could help the Scottish Government to manage that volatility better?
Sorry, Alistair, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, well, one element of the forecast errors in social security is it's a learning process for us, and we've, I think, previously discussed the experience of forecasting the first new benefit Best Start grant, and the crucial challenge for us, and often the focus of the discussions that David talked about, is quite detailed discussions with the social security people about what their expectations are about take-up rates, and with government policy people about what their objectives are about take-up rates. But it's still highly judgmental. But we do learn from it, and the experience of forecasting the take-up rate for Best Start grant and understanding the challenges that happened there have informed our subsequent forecasts, for example, particularly of the Scottish child payment. So I would be optimistic that we would certainly be optimistic. We would expect that as we gain experience of forecasting a succession of new developments, and as the new developments become familiar developments, then the crucial issue of forecasting take-up rates we would expect to get much better at that.
So Professor, you've in effect encapsulated what your other colleagues have already said. I suppose my more specific point was that given the volatility to the Scottish budget has increased, the powers to manage that volatility have not. And given that the fiscal framework will be reviewed in due course, are there more tools that, in theory anyway, would be useful for the Scottish Government to acquire, whether that was around borrowing or some other aspect?
Well, there is volatility in the budget. It's an interesting question whether the £3 billion pounds or so of social security expenditure increases the general level of volatility, because the volatility arising from the income tax forecasts is already very substantial. So I would say that the general question is not that, social security, by adding another volatile element to the budget, is something that certainly needs to be thought about. But the general issue of what should be done about Scottish borrowing powers and whether adjustments to the fiscal framework are really a matter for the government and Parliament to consider. Our job is to draw attention to the volatility that exists, which we aim to do in our forecasts, and we discuss the income tax reconciliations and the implication of that for future government.
Okay.
So because, as we said, there are so many there are more moving parts in the whole budget process than there have been historically, that I think one thing we would say is it's important to try and keep track of all those and to monitor those. So within the current framework, there's more that can be done to actually make sure that all of those different elements are kept track of, so that we know where the overall position is moving. So I think, it's not directly answering your question, but it's saying within the current framework there is capacity to try and manage this volatility by monitoring all these different moving parts carefully through time.
But even more specifically, if one looks at this social security expenditure in terms of the whole picture of the whole Scottish budget, if more has to be spent there, less will have to be spent somewhere else. There is a sort of check and balance. It's not that social security sits just entirely on its own. But I think the point is right, that the discussions in the fiscal framework are between the two governments, and they could well consider other aspects.
No, I understand it's perhaps your job to highlight the problems, and finding the solutions is for the rest of us. But I just wondered, a factual question, how do the UK government manage, what tools do they have at their disposal to manage risks around demand-led social security across the UK?
Well, the UK government has got much greater borrowing power, so the UK government managing a social security, just to stick with the social security example, managing a social security budget that's proportionately much bigger than the Scottish government's budget, because it includes the full range of UK benefits, doesn't have to worry about in-year reconciliations, because it has borrowing powers that deal with that of a scale that the Scottish government doesn't have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Angela. 3.5% might not be a dreadful sum, which I think was your phrase, Susan, but 3.5% of 3.2 billion is a very big sum. And I don't think anybody should underestimate the concern that this committee has about our ability as a parliament to manage the risks that come with that. I was very struck by what Professor Breeden had to say just now. In the fiscal framework and the review of the fiscal framework is one thing, but what adjustments can we make in the budget process now? You said that there's more that we can do. I'd like to draw you out a bit on that. What more can we do within the existing framework, within the existing budget processes, to make sure that we are managing these risks appropriately?
I think, as is often the case, the amount of clarity about the budget process is improving, steadily. But I think the issue we have is that because these moving parts have arrived, I think there's room for even more progress on that side, so that effectively we understand how the budget is progressing through the year. And I think we're particularly interested in how much there were obviously some rather unique circumstances that meant that this forecast has been a little bit more uncertain than usual. We're hoping that by the time we come to our next forecast, we'll have much more clarity about the overall budget position, and that will, I think, will mean more information about how things like within year reconciliations are progressing, what the leeway is that there is in the system.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to be more specific than that.
Well,
but that's the
I'm
sort of
interested.
general-
I mean, people have talked about borrowing, but nobody's talking about using the Scotland Reserve. So why isn't anybody talking about using the Scotland Reserve?
No, I mean, I think clearly that's an issue we would highlight, that the reserve is an important. The buffers in the system are relatively limited, and the reserve is one of those buffers, and that will be an important thing to keep track of or throughout the year, because that is one of the buffers that that's going to manage this volatility that is coming about.
Okay, well, I suspect this is an issue that people are going to want to come back to. Meanwhile, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Convener. I want to move us on slightly in terms of the volatility, in terms of the timing of this year's budget. And one of the points you make in the introduction to your report is that monitoring and management of the budget through the course of the year will be increasingly important, with more parts of the budget being variable and harder to predict. But of course this year we've got the unusual feature that we've got a budget before we know what the UK budget is. And one of the comments you make is that it is reasonable to expect there will be increases in the UK government spending announced in the March budget, and for the Scottish Government to include some provision in estimating the total size of their budget, because we'll only know the size of the consequences after the UK budget. So it's really to get your comment on how you think that has worked this year with the budget, and what implications it has, because we're looking here at, we've been talking about tax intake, we've been talking about productivity. There's something about the impact and the effectiveness of expenditure, and if that's decided later on in the year, what are the impacts of that, and how you monitor the effectiveness of that budget spending?
Well, I think there have been a number of impacts of the timing of the budgets. One has been in terms of the Barnett consequentials, and what has happened there is the Scottish Government has made some assumptions about Barnett consequentials based on the spending review of the Conservatives in September last year. They've also factored in some allowance for what was in the Conservative manifesto, which was on the whole quite a modest manifesto. And they've made some other adjustments to the Barnett consequentials. But we do recognise that in the budget on the 11th of March, there could be quite significant spending increases announced by the government, which would then flow through in terms of Barnett consequentials. And that would be one of the levers that might be around to help you manage the social security impact. If there were higher Barnett consequentials coming through, those could be helped. Those could be used to help manage the social security impacts. But the other things that have been affected by the timing of the budget have been all the block grant adjustments. Now, those were based on the OBR forecasts from last year. For Social Security, those went back to March. For income tax, they went back to December, when the OBR was forecasting for the Welsh budget. But there's still going to be updated block grant adjustments in the budget through the updated OBR forecasts. At the moment, it's very hard to say in what direction those are going to go there. So these are elements which the government will have a choice as to whether to take the provisional block grant adjustments that are in the budget at the moment, or to accept the higher, or to accept the block grant adjustment that comes out following the OBR updated calculations on income tax. That will be a decision for the Scottish Government to make. Now, our strong advice would be not to update the income tax block grant adjustment without knowing what the updated income tax forecast is going to be. You'll get that updated forecast from us in May. So our advice would be wait until May, when you've actually learned what has happened in the UK budget what our updated forecasts are, then you have all the information you need to make the right decisions about how to manage the budget you will actually have at that point.
Mm-hmm. So that actually sounds very sensible, but it then takes you to a point where you don't actually know what your potential new expenditure options are going to be till quite into the year. And there's the issue of the Scottish Government setting its budget and allocations, but I'm thinking of the impact down the line of different organisations that might be given those budget allocations, how well they might be able to anticipate or spend if it's actually a relatively short period in the year.
Again, it's only 2 months into the year, so they may have enough reserve so they can monitor their spending, knowing that there will be potential changes coming down the line.
Does mean that everybody's moving slightly down the track, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
and
does.
the volatility that has been mentioned by several people already, but I'm thinking of whether it's investment in infrastructure, or you've talked earlier about productivity and trying to create high-quality jobs. That must become harder the later in the year that you can give certainty to organisations or budget lines that are going to be funded, when there's already a nervousness about having annual budgets. That actually becomes very difficult in terms of making sensible expenditure. Is that something you would comment on?
Well, the infrastructure investment, that could be affected more by the capital powers, the funding powers that the government has, rather than the resource element of the budget, which was what I was talking about.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the planning for that infrastructure. It doesn't happen from nowhere. You've got to have the staff, you've got to have strategic planning. There's something about the certainty here which came across strongly about the lack of certainty, and this year being particularly challenging. So it's what lessons would you factor in for future advice to the government?
Well, I think it's also important to add that we shouldn't assume that if the things which David has just talked about, the Barnett consequentials or the revised tax, BGA and revenue forecasts, led the government to have more money available to put in the budget. It's not necessarily the case that the right thing to do is desperately try and spend it in the current year, given that we know, for reasons which we have outlined in our report, there are substantial budget challenges likely to be faced in future years, and one of the options which the government needs to look at is, if there's a bit more leeway, do you book that for next year rather than trying to spend it this year?
So potentially less borrowing and make that your balance.
Yes, I think it's just, as I said before, one solution to your problem is, more careful use of the buffers that you have in the system already. I think that's a decision to be made by the government. But I think that is a solution, is that that you don't pass that volatility necessarily on to the departments if you carefully manage the budget buffers that you have available to you, which include the borrowing and the reserve.
Okay.
I find this all a bit depressing, I have to say. I mean, at the beginning of this Parliament, there was really, I think, some optimism around that. We could move to multi-year budgeting. We have a thing now called a medium-term financial strategy. Although there's a question mark about how much strategy there is in that document and how medium-term it really is. But we have at least a document called that. And now you're telling us we can't even look beyond May very coherently, and it's already February. So can you cheer me up?
The big distinction between, the issues we're talking about, I mean, they seem very big to us right now, but they are really, between year transfers, they're more cash management issues than long-term issues. I think it is entirely possible to have a long-term view about budget process while still having the headache of how do I manage, money that should, I need this year compared to next year. So I think it's useful to think that there's compartments which are cash management and long-term budgeting, and try and keep those separate, I think. And I think it is possible to do both long-term and budgeting and cash management.
Could I just say that when we say May, we're saying that in the last few years that has been the timing for the MTFS. We don't yet know this year what the timing will be, so we're simply saying May as a general comment. It's 2 months after the start of the year. It doesn't mean that is the outer limit at which one can look, but at that point we will have up-to-date information, up-to-date data, we'll have up-to-date OBR forecasts, and we will do another overall forecast, which will give very good information. I think that that will, equip people. It's not ideal, and so I agree with you there. It's not ideal, but certainly that equips you to go and look further and beyond May.
I'm not that much cheered up, so maybe Murdo can help me I think you want to talk about reconciliation.
I do. Yeah. I think you're living in hope there.
Absolutely.
Convener.
Absolutely. I'm always an optimist.
Indeed. I want to ask you about the issue of tax reconciliations that you cover in your paper, and you make the point that the final reconciliation applied in the current budget is a negative of 207 million, and then you update your forecasts for the reconciliations for the coming year for next year's budget, a negative of 555 million, and the following year a negative of 211 billion. And what we understand in the current budget year, the 207 million negative reconciliation is not being paid out of the current budget, but is being borrowed, so will be repaid over the coming 5 years. What we were told by our budget advisor is that resource spending in this budget is up almost 5% in real terms compared to the previous year. So there is more money there in this budget. And I'm just wondering how prudent you think it is for the Scottish Government, instead of using the resources they have now to repay, in effect, repay this money, that they're borrowing it, given what's coming down the track next year, which is a much, much larger sum, and the year after.
Well, you're correct, as we've described in our report. This year's reconciliation of 207 million pounds is being met by borrowing, and our judgment is that that's a reasonable use of the government's borrowing powers. But I also agree with you that the current indications of next year's reconciliation is much bigger at 555 million. And the issue of whether the government is making adequate provision for that reconciliation, given the limitations on its borrowing powers, is an issue for the government, not for us. We're commenting on what the government is doing this year, and it is a reasonable use of their powers. But
to their powers.
Well, it's because that's one of the things that they have the borrowing powers for, is for forecast errors. So using the borrowing powers to deal with the reconciliation of 200 million is one of the reasons why they have those borrowing powers. And what I'm saying is that's reasonable. The question of whether they're thinking far enough ahead about the 500 million next year is a question for the government, not for us.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Of course, this money that's borrowing, I think, has to be paid back over 5 years. So it's just postponing the problem towards a future budget. We have an election next year to the Scottish Parliament. Is it unduly cynical to suggest that this is the government seeking to postpone the pain till after the election, so the coffers are as full as possible for spending pre-budget, pre-election?
You may say so, being very challenging. The chairman wants to be cheered up, and you want to have judgments about cynicism. I think you're both stretching the limits of the Fiscal Commission's remit.
I thought they would give it a try.
Can I ask a couple of follow-up questions on this, irrespective of optimism and pessimism and cynicism and everything else? Just a couple of, I hope, factual questions or analytical questions about this issue with regard to reconciliation. Your May forecasts raised the possibility of negative income tax reconciliations of around £1 billion, which will need to be dealt with, as Murdo said, over the course of the next 3 budgets. And we now have audited outturn data for 2017-18 and substantial published outturn data for 2018-19, and the figure is still around £1 billion. So the first question I have about this is this figure likely to change much when the fully audited figures for 2018-19 are published in July? Secondly, and relatedly, you also suggest in your report that the Scottish Government's response to the 2017-18 reconciliation should be considered alongside possible future reconciliations. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, if I take the second one first, that's that's another version of what I was just saying in response to Mr. Fraser's question, that the issue of this year's £204 million reconciliation should ideally not be thought of in isolation from the further reconciliations that are coming down the line, because we need to look at the full scale of the issue. On your first question, the 555 is an indication, an estimate. It's not a final figure, but we're now close enough to having the final figure that I think we would be surprised if it were very different. We're always professionally conscious about injecting overconfidence into figures, but but our experience so far with these reconciliation figures is they bump around quite a bit. But the 204 settled down some into that area some time before the final figures and our current. It would certainly be wise for the Scottish Government to assume that next year's reconciliation is going to be in the area of 550 million, rather than hope that that it might turn out to be very different. It's unlikely to be very different from that.
Okay, that's helpful. I do want to go back to this question of reasonableness and how you've assessed it. As the SFC, you have a statutory responsibility to assess the reasonableness of Scottish ministers' borrowing, as I understand the statute that governs you. So I want to know, how have you fulfilled that reasonableness assessment with regard to their use of the borrowing power this year?
I could start off and then... So I think it's got two elements. I think the first element is it mechanically within the terms of the fiscal framework? And the answer to that around the reconciliation is yes, it is. It's beneath the borrowing cap.
Indeed.
And
that shows that it's lawful. It doesn't necessarily show that it's reasonable.
It's not law, because the fiscal framework is not law, but it's certainly within the terms of the fiscal framework, yes. And then the reasonableness, I think, is where it becomes more difficult in terms of, because it's all shades of grey. And I think what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to produce a sense of what's coming up in the future, and does it make sense for, what does the government know now? And I think one of the messages that we're very clear about is that, to some extent, the government doesn't quite have the full picture yet, and it needs to wait until May until it has the full picture. And then it will know a lot more about the size of the Barnett consequentials, it will, relative to its spending. It will know more about its underspend this current financial year and how that has affected its reserves. So at the moment, we're sort of thinking, well, they need to wait until May, until they've got greater clarity about the reserves and the Barnett consequentials, and also UK income tax policy. And they have our next set of forecasts in May as well. And then I think it's all the issues that Francis and Alistair have been talking about in terms of looking forward and knowing what's coming down in terms of future reconciliations as well, and where do you need to sort of, what do your reserve need to be in order to cope with those? So it's got a number of parts, that process of thinking about the reasonableness of the borrowing.
And we have tried in ways that I've just been outlining to draw your attention and the government's attention to the issues that need to be thought about. And just to add to what John said, takes me back to my response to Ms. Boyack's question. If the Barnett consequentials and other things that come along with the UK government give the Scottish government more leeway, then it might be right to use that leeway to increase current spending, but they need to look very hard at whether that is right, given the challenges that there are further down the line. So we have set out in our report the challenges down the line and indicated that the government needs to think about how, if additional leeway comes along in March or May, how they need to think quite hard about how to use that additional leeway if it comes along. The other thing that I would say that needs to be thought about, and again it's a point that is mentioned in our report, when you think about negative consequentials and the need to borrow for them, it's worth thinking about the fact that a negative consequential is already a borrowing. As we say, it's a kind of interest-free loan.
Reconciliation.
Sorry, thank you very much, Francis. A negative reconciliation is already a kind of borrowing because this year's 204 million says 3 years ago the government thought it was going to have 200 million pounds more of income tax revenue to spend than it turns out it had. It spent it. It went into the budget in 2017-18, was spent. So when the reconciliation comes along next fiscal year, that's effectively been an interest-free loan. And putting the question that you put back to me, not back to you, not for you to answer, but as a question for the government to think about, is the right response to a 204 million pound interest-free loan having come to an end, to roll it into further borrowing? Well, there are different ways of answering that question, but that's one way to think about it.
But for me, as a lawyer rather than an economist, the critical question is that you understand that your analysis of this is a two-step process. First, is it within the scope of the powers? But that does not exhaust the reasonableness inquiry, because an exercise of power that is within scope, whether we're talking about within the scope of the legislation or within the scope of the fiscal framework, which is not legislation, is a narrower question than the statutory responsibility that you have to ensure that the use of these powers is reasonable, not merely lawful, not merely proper, but reasonable. And you understand that that's a two-step process, and that you have a methodology for looking at the reasonableness as well as the propriety of that, of the use of those powers. That's what Mr. Ireland confirmed in his answer. That my understanding is correct, is it?
I'll say yes, rather than just nodding my head.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you very much. Tom, very briefly.
Convener, just a very brief point of clarification following on from Murdo Fraser's question. I think Mr. Fraser had referenced a 5% uplift in the resource budget, but just to confirm, that would be when excluding social security and farm payments, that would be a cash uplift, but the real uplift would be about 3.7% in the resource budget. I'm going on the Scottish Parliament Information Centre figures here.
We don't produce that analysis at the moment.
That's
so
fine,
that's their figures.
But in terms of what you're including within the overall resource budget available, that includes the money that has been borrowed as well, doesn't it? I'm just looking if I consider.
I think there's a table one in the summary which does include that. Yes.
So that actual some of that resource money, that money that is being borrowed, is counting towards that cash uplift.
It's counting towards the resource total
I beg your pardon, the resource
table.
uplift.
Yeah.
So part of the money that's being borrowed is what's counting towards that uplift, which was referenced by Mr. Fraser. Obviously, money can't be spent twice. No, I just wanted to clarify that point. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses from this session. I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes to allow changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much. Okay, for this second session, we're joined by Kate Forbes, Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, and the Minister is joined by Lucy O'Carroll, Director of Tax, and Andrew Watson, Head of Directorate for Budget and Public Spending from the Scottish Government. I'd like to welcome the Minister and her officials to our meeting. And Minister, do you want to make a few opening remarks?
Very brief, because I know Susan Rice managed to make it less than 2 minutes. So very happy to be here. And just 2 words of thanks to begin with to the committee. First of all, because I know that you've played a very helpful role in terms of the challenging budget process this year, and the same goes to the Fiscal Commission as well. In terms of this year's budget, there are 4 strategic aims in this year's budget. The first is wellbeing, second is climate emergency, third is inclusive economic growth, and the fourth is tackling poverty, particularly child poverty. In terms of tax, we're trying to provide as much certainty as we can to taxpayers, despite some of the uncertainties around what the UK government might do on tax on the 11th of March. So the income tax structure introduced in 2017 remains in place. And just finally and lastly, there are obviously some several fiscal uncertainties facing this year's budget. We've tried to make assumptions, which I can go into in the question session, about the Barnett consequentials that are flowing from the UK budget, and those are based almost entirely on the Conservative Party manifesto, but there will obviously be implications in terms of block grant adjustments. And my very final point, and I think that is under 2 minutes, is that it's a tight process, of course, with stage 3 on the 5th of March. And I'm very keen, as I emphasised on Thursday, to work on a cross-party basis to get the budget through in order to ensure that we provide that certainty to local government, public sector and to taxpayers.
Thank you very much. May this trend for brief opening statements survive. Minister, Spice tell us that Scottish taxpayers will be paying £650 million more tax in 2020-2021 due to your government's tax policies, compared with the position in the UK, and yet the benefit to the public finances is forecast to be only £46 million. Why is this?
Well, I think what matters to the public sector in particular is the amount of tax take that's going directly into our public services. And if we were to replicate entirely the UK government's approach to tax, then there would be £460 million less going into the public sector than we have been able to provide. So our tax decisions over the last few years and this year mitigate some of the impact of austerity that we've seen on our budget to ensure that we are investing in the public sector. But your question goes right to the heart of the fiscal framework, and I think that's the key in all of this, because when it comes to the fiscal framework, I would suggest that the problem under the fiscal framework is not that we're raising less tax, it's that we're punished for rising inequality south of the border. And I know you had the Scottish Fiscal Commission in just before this, but in terms of the fiscal framework, that is why we're certainly pushing for early review of the fiscal framework, because some of the challenges which have been considered by the committee previously on the fiscal framework, and as the committee knows, are quite difficult to unpick in terms of the size of the tax base and the way in which the fiscal framework and indeed the forecasts pick up on the Scottish tax base. Now, I think that data is improving with every year, but I believe that when the fiscal framework was first signed up to by all parties in good faith, the very fact that there was a built-in review suggests to us that there was an understanding that it would have to be improved at some point.
Well, and that it's a learning process, and that what this committee is learning is, as you know, Minister, that every budget is a learning process. Does it go to the heart of the fiscal framework, or does it go to the heart of the need for the Scottish Government to do everything it can to grow the Scottish economy, and specifically to grow the Scottish income tax base? So, I mean, that's what we heard from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, that in a number of these issues are not strictly speaking budget issues, they are broader economic and indeed perhaps even also social policy issues. So can I ask, what specific policies does your government have to grow the Scottish income tax base?
So I think it's a very fair question. I think the way that you identified it in terms of both areas of the fiscal framework and also the need to grow the economy are key. And my direct answer to your question is also found in the SFC's document talking about strengthening earnings growth. And we recognise in terms of growing the economy that there's 2 ways of doing that. The first is to boost productivity. And in terms of the substance of the budget, our focus is on ensuring that we are stimulating the economy, that we are using our enterprise agencies to ensure that we're investing in the economy. And we've got, this is the second year of the National Infrastructure Mission, for example, which sees an increase yet again in infrastructure spend, all ways to boost the economy. But the second area in terms of earnings, I think the trajectory identified by the Scottish Fiscal Commission in terms of a strengthened earnings potential is to be welcomed. And I think it shows the impact not just of our tax policies, but also of our public sector pay policy. And together, both of those are aimed at supporting those who are on lower incomes. And I think the impact of those decisions last year are now being seen in that stronger earnings potential that's coming through the forecasts.
I would never seek to argue with you that economic growth generally is not important. Economic growth clearly is important, but I just want to hone down on this very specifically on this question of how we grow the Scottish income tax base, because that was the focus of a number of the questions with the SFC earlier this morning, that the SFC felt it was inappropriate for them to answer because they're not questions which fall, strictly speaking, within its remit, but they do fall within your remit, Minister. So what policies is the government pursuing to increase the number of income taxpayers in Scotland? And what policies is the Scottish Government pursuing to drive or to seek to drive their earnings up? Because obviously it's the case that the more you earn in income, the higher your contribution in income tax receipts, which will help. And if you get those things right, it seems to me it would begin to close what is an eye-watering, an astonishing gap between £650 million of additional tax paid, yielding only £46 million of additional revenues for the Scottish Government.
Two ways to grow the tax base. First is immigration and attracting population to this country. And as you'll know, the Scottish Government is doing an enormous amount at the moment in terms of attracting people to live, work and invest in Scotland. We recognise that our population growth needs to increase, and recent announcements around, even, for example, a Scottish visa go right to the heart of that. While that was dismissed within a matter of hours, at the end of the day, that proposition was heavily informed by the business community who have identified the need for skills. But the second way of doing it is tackling non-participation, so inactivity, and also trying to get more people into work. And I could identify a number of measures that are in our budget this year, building on previous budgets that are trying to do that. So whether that's Fair Start Scotland, which is our employment support mechanism, which has seen a total of 16,130 people joining Fair Start Scotland to get into work, whether it's in my own area around digital, trying to attract people within the tech space that are currently not in the workforce at all. So I think building, yes, our population, but also trying to support people into work who are not currently in work. But at the end of the day, when it comes to our budget, and that's why I started talking about the strategic aims. The strategic aim of this budget is as a well-being budget. So we have consciously made decisions on both revenue raising and revenue spend, which support those at the lower end of the spectrum to build their earnings potential and also to attract people into the workforce that are not currently in the workforce. And I think our public sector pay policy in that regard is often overlooked in terms of the impact it has generally on earnings.
Okay, thank you. A number of members might want to come back on a number of those issues, but one of the most contested issues of the budget, perhaps this year and certainly in recent years, has been the local government element of the budget, and a number of members want to ask you questions about that, starting with Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You've made the argument, as the Scottish Government has over recent years, that additional money going to local government, which pays for additional functions of local government, should be seen as part of the overall pot. And the response from local government is that money should not be counted in terms of the core unring-fenced allocation. In order to continue to provide their core services, they need a real terms stability, at least, preferably a real terms increase in the funding that they receive before those additional funds for additional functions. COSLA at the moment are saying that the current budget falls short by 95 million on the revenue side, and substantially more, 117 on the capital side. That would be a 17% cut on the capital side. I'm sure I'm not the only person sitting around this table who's had colleagues from local government telling me that the kind of choices that they and their colleagues are going to be faced with as they set their budgets in the coming weeks will result in substantial reductions in core services, teacher numbers, additional support for learning, social care. They have serious concerns that councils will be placed in breach of their legal duties as a result of choices that they will be forced to make in the current situation. How many of your colleagues have been expressing those same concerns to you?
Well, when it comes to local government, and of course I speak to my colleagues on a regular basis, and I'm meeting with COSLA later this afternoon. In terms of the settlement for local government, as I said on Thursday, if you look at the figures, there's a real terms, there's a cash increase, and there's a real terms increase going to local government in terms of the resource budget. So the figure in terms of the cash increase is £494 million. But what's key, and to get to the heart of your question around commitments that have been made, that core settlement, and of course there is no baselining from year to year, but that core settlement includes us funding our commitments around early learning and childcare, for example, in terms of 201 million of revenue and also 121 million pounds of capital. It includes us funding our commitments on teachers' pay, 156 million, and also on pensions. And pensions it goes, I think, to the heart of this difficulty around talk of ring fencing, because local authorities last year had complete autonomy over 92% of their budget. But I accept that there are challenges that they're facing. So pensions being a good example, where decisions that were taken in terms of policy at a UK government level, which did not match the full consequentials that came to us and therefore to pass on, meant that we increased on those consequentials to support local government funding what was essentially a new commitment, but it's not one of their making or one of our making. There's also significant increases in this local government settlement for social care. Now, some of the points that COSLA has raised in terms of additional commitments are things around, for example, paying the living wage. Now, I would see that all as part of local authorities' core remit in terms of core responsibilities, and we are providing the funding to meet those responsibilities. But the difference between local authorities and most other governments, most other government departments, as it were, is that unlike health, for example, which has to deal with pension increases as well, local government also has the option of revenue raising. And that's where this year we have, they can raise council tax by 3% in real terms, which could see an additional £135 million added to their budgets. So overall, now if I talked about resource there, very happy to go into detail on capital unless you've got other questions. But I would say that this is a fair settlement. Nobody's pretending that the overall budget is an easy process. There are challenges right across the board because of our commitment to pass on health consequentials. But I still strongly believe that we have protected local government and supported them to deliver the responsibilities that we deliver in partnership.
I'm sure you didn't intend, Minister, to suggest that local government is a department of the Scottish Government. It is a different tier of government in its own right, and it would be equally inappropriate if the UK Government, for example, was to treat the Scottish Government as a department. I'm sure that wasn't the intention. However, on two, possibly three occasions in that answer, you used the phrase, "we are funding our commitments." And it seemed pretty clear to me that the we you were referring to was the Scottish Government. If the Scottish Government funds local government to provide, provides funds to local government to meet Scottish Government policy commitments, that may well be a very good thing. It may well pay for work that we would all like to see happen and that we would all politically support. but it doesn't change the underlying pressures on local government to do the work which is already theirs to do. So I want to ask you again, have you had representations from your own colleagues in local government reflecting on the severe, damaging consequences of the choices they will be forced to make as they set their budgets this year?
In answer to your question, I speak on behalf of the Scottish Government, so when I refer to we, that is referring to the Scottish Government. In terms of core responsibilities, I think you'd be hard-pressed to hear local authorities say that providing early learning and childcare is not their core responsibility, providing education is not their core responsibility. And my point is that we're supporting local authorities to deliver their responsibilities, but we recognise something that we want to deliver in partnership with them. And early learning and childcare is a great example that was developed very closely in partnership with local authorities who identified the revenue needs that they have and which we have funded in this. In terms of the point about representations, I have representations from everybody. Suddenly my inbox is a lot busier than it was before Thursday, but I will be meeting...
I should imagine somewhat angrier as well.
Debatable. But I will be meeting COSLA later on today, and local government is not a government department. The point I was making is that when it comes to some of these commitments, take, for example, pension costs, which are a direct result about a change in policy that is at a UK government level, there are things that local government can do in terms of revenue raising to mitigate against that other areas of the wider public sector can't do.
I know other members want to come in on this. If I come back later on the final issues, that would be fine.
Absolutely, Patrick. Thank you very much. Sarah, and then Murdo on local government.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd like to just follow up the questions that Patrick Harvey was asking in relation to local government, both in terms of revenue expenditure and in terms of capital expenditure, because you said in your introduction about the core objectives of the Scottish Government in terms of well-being and inclusive economic growth, and it's just to run through the impact on revenue expenditure being reduced. You said that care was going to be fully funded, yet our local authority colleagues are concerned about the 95 million cut to core budgets. So the worry about providing that care, given that we've got a changing demographic that's with us now, and the impact in relation to IGBs, the funding across there. Many of us have had reports from our local government colleagues of cuts there, and we've focused on core funding, rightly because that's critical in terms of education and care, but there is a whole raft of other funding challenges, whether it's roads maintenance, sports, libraries, economic development, which we are going to see cuts across the country on. So your comment on that. And in terms of the infrastructure expenditure, the £117 million cut is viewed in local government as critical. It sits alongside the cut in this year's budget in terms of the town centre fund. Doesn't that make it harder for local government to make the impact with those combined cuts in their communities as key economic driver, given the budget that they're facing this year?
I think there's about 3 questions in there. The first is just to emphasise once again in terms of how local authorities are funded, that they have autonomy. So last year, 92% of funding, they had autonomy over how to spend it. But in terms of social care, you're right that it is a rising area of demand and pressure for local authorities. And this year, in terms of the total transferred from the health portfolio to support health and social care integration, that comes to £811 million next year. And that includes the ongoing additional £355 million that's transferred from the NHS to integration authorities to ensure improved outcomes on social care. And in addition to the 160 million that was available last year, there is a further 100 million to be transferred in year from health to local government to support health and social care and mental health services that are delegated to integration authorities. So the point I was making is that we recognise that this is an area of pressure for local government. It's an area of pressure that they've identified, and it's an area that we are therefore funding as part of this year's budget settlement. In terms of capital, You mentioned that one of our aims was around climate change. And so I think it stands to reason that in light of our commitment to look at every line of the budget through that commitment to make this a budget that responds to the climate change emergency, we have taken that into account when it comes to local government as well. So in terms of local government capital, I think there's 3 things to identify. First of all, last year there was a number of one-offs. So there was a reprofiling of £150 million in capital, which was a one-off, and you also mentioned the Town Centre Fund. That was a one-off. So that's got to be taken into account when it comes to the context. The second point is around the new areas of spend that are specifically on climate change mitigation that are going to local authorities. So the most obvious one in that case is the £50 million Heat Networks Early Adopter Challenge, which is a new fund to support local authorities that are ready to bring forward investment-ready heat networks. So we have consciously chosen to support capital spend within the local authority settlement that reflects our commitments around climate change, which I think is the right decision. And the third area that I wanted to mention is around the amount of capital that local authorities receive over and above the local authority settlement. So one of the big areas of spend in this year, as it was in last year, was the spend on affordable housing, £835 million. Now, that meets local authorities' responsibilities when it comes to providing affordable housing. The other area is the Schools for the Future programme, the £1 billion Schools for the Future programme, to support investment in the school estate. Again, that's over and above the local authority settlement. And the last area would be on city deals, which again is going directly to local authorities to spend on their local economies and on areas that are of concern to local authorities, but that is over and above the capital settlement that local authorities will get as part of this year.
Thank you very much for that answer. So can I take it that you think that town centres tick the box? We've sorted that. I actually mentioned it in terms of economic investment in local communities. I hadn't mentioned the words climate change. I might have been coming on to that. So that's a key issue. You said it was a one-off expenditure last year, so it's gone. So local authorities now have to look at that major issue from a declining capital expenditure budget.
Can I respond? I don't think anybody would suggest that investing in our town centres will solely be done through a £50 million pot. I think, as I'm frequently reminded by all colleagues, there's a lot of other areas that are critically important, not least non-domestic rates, in terms of how we support town centres and how we support the transition to a digital economy that probably has far more to bear on town centres than a £50 million fund, as welcome as I know it was last year.
I think that's my point. It's not a one-off. It has to be an ongoing commitment, and it's a real issue now in terms of remaking our towns.
But sorry, you're essentially asking me to ring-fence £50 million for town centres when actually we're trying to reduce the amount of ring-fencing.
No, my point was the opposite, that you've cut the amount of money in terms of capital investment for local authorities, and there was a little bonus last year. So it's going to make it doubly hard this year because the money has gone down. The other point I'd made about economic impact in local areas, you didn't answer that question that I asked in terms of the capacity of local government, both in revenue and capital, to invest in economic development at a point where their budgets are being cut and they have core priorities they must meet.
Well, I would disagree that we are reducing their potential to invest in their local economies, considering the amount of infrastructure spend that is included in this year's budget, which often is managed by local authorities. If you take, for example, our target of delivering 50,000 affordable homes, affordable housing is the responsibility of local authorities, but it's an area that we recognise there's extreme pressure on, and that's why this year again there's £843 million in the budget to support affordable homes. So that directly, in terms of infrastructure spend and construction, has a huge impact on local economies. And I think taken together with the core capital spend that's part of this year's local government budget, there is the option for local authorities to invest in capital over and above the amount that's going through city deals, affordable housing, Schools for the Future programme and the Nursery Capital Fund.
Okay, thank you, Murdo.
Thank you. Good morning. The Scottish Government's resource budget is going up from this year to the next. According to SPICE, they put the increase at 3.7% in real terms. Our budget advisor says 5%. We'll let them fight between themselves as to who's right on those figures. But it's going up, and it's going up quite substantially. And yet, according to COSLA, you are delivering a revenue core budget cut to local authorities of 95 million or 1% in real terms. Why is that fair?
Well, what is clear from the figures that if you pass on, and I can break down the spend that's associated with the slight increase in the Scottish Government's budget, if you go through the figures in terms of how that is funded, then you can't get away from the fact that there is still a squeeze on most portfolio areas with the exception of health. So we've factored into this year's budget, for example, the 1.1 billion that was announced as part of the spending review, and we've assumed that the Conservatives meant what they said at the December election, and we've factored in, when it comes to consequentials, £468 million. Of that, 142 million is resource, the rest is capital. So we factored that into our budget. But if you break that down, I know that Conservatives are keen that we pass on health consequentials in full. So if you break that down, £635 million of the spending round uplift, plus £120 million of the anticipated consequentials, go straight to health. After you allocate based on passing on health consequentials, then you see a real terms decrease in all other budget areas. And that's what we've got to contend with as we go into this year's budget. So our commitment has always been to protect local authority as far as we are able. And I think that's why the point can be made that whilst local authorities in England and Wales are, to quote COSLA's finance spokesperson, collapsing, that's not the case in Scotland. And we, as I said, I'm meeting COSLA later today. We continue to discuss and negotiate with them. But the decisions we've made in this budget, in light of the resources that we have available to us, are endeavouring as far as we can to protect local authorities.
Okay, I mean, I'll happily debate all the detailed figures on another occasion. I just wanted to illustrate this with two local examples. Fife Council, in the area I represent, which is a SNP Labour joint administration, even with the maximum uplift in council tax, are looking at £12 million of cuts and a cost of 90 jobs. That's 90 people losing their employment as a result of this offer. I had a meeting on Friday with Perth and Kinross Council, Conservative minority administration. They are looking at making budget savings. One of the things they might have to cut is local recycling centres in rural communities, which would mean people living there would have to either not recycle or face a 20, 30-mile round trip to the nearest urban recycling centre. Now, you said at the start that part of your budget objective was delivering a budget that would tackle the climate emergency. Would you accept there would be a real irony if a budget meant to tackle the climate emergency passed on cuts to local councils that meant they were less able to take measures to tackle climate change, in fact, made it more difficult?
I don't think there's any way you can get away from the fact that we are still dealing with a decade of austerity, no matter which way you look at it. That in the last 2 years, chancellors have announced that that year would be the end to austerity, and that hasn't been the case. This year's budget is set in the context of putting assumptions into our budget of consequentials that might come that we don't know for a fact will come, because all engagement between officials in the Scottish Government and at Treasury have merely resulted in officials at Treasury referring us to the Conservative Party manifesto. So that is the nature of the assumptions that we have made going into this year's budget. And we have tried to take, as I said, those costings at face value. But there's no way of escaping that we're doing that after a decade of austerity. And I think in light of the challenges around the climate emergency, we have tried to take a different approach when it comes to capital spend that's going to local authorities, in the same way that we've taken a different approach in every budget line. And that includes trying to support local authorities to mitigate climate change with, for example, the Heat Networks Challenge, which is a new fund to support them to do that. Now, in terms of the Fife Council, in terms of Perth and Kinross, both budgets are going up in real terms. Now, we can debate whether or not that is core or whether that's additional. But ultimately, that is going towards the public services that people expect to see. And local authorities have full, well, relatively full control over how it's spent, and it is spent on local services. But the point remains to any party and everybody around this table that I've confirmed that every penny that we can deploy is on the face of the budget. It's there. We are unable, in light of the sharp time constraints, and in light of the fact that we still don't have many guarantees over consequentials, the money's there. If members believe that that money should be spent on local authorities and removed from somewhere else, then it's perfectly within their right to make that argument. My point would be, tell me where to take it from.
One more on local government before we'll move on to other areas. Neil.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Given the Scottish Government's capital budget has increased by 13.2% in real terms, I think the cuts to council capital budgets are particularly obscene. Councils are getting less in their capital budgets than expected, and councils will now have to re-evaluate what projects they can deliver. Do you accept that there are projects that councils want to take forward that they will no longer be able to as a result of this budget? And if they want to make up the shortfall, then they will have to borrow, and that in turn will have implications for their revenue budgets as well.
I think that local authorities have the freedom to make decisions about what they invest in terms of the points I've already made, that this year's budget sees an increase in capital, and that is matched by our significant increase in infrastructure, low carbon infrastructure spend. And the new money, as it were, the new funds that are available to local authorities when it comes to capital reflect that changed commitment to mitigating climate change. But in terms of the overall settlement, we've provided £763.1 million plus over £380 million that is out with the local government settlement and to local authorities. And that includes the city deal money, and it includes 100 million more in total than last year. And so that, as an overall package, reflects an overall increase in capital that local authorities will have available to them.
I hear what you're saying, Minister, but councils are saying that this is another budget and another round of cuts to local councils. Can I ask you about resource? Education was declared as the defining priority for the First Minister. But in 2018-19, according to analysis of the Improvement Service Local Government Benchmarking Framework, it shows Scotland's primary school children had £288 per child less spent on them compared to 2010-11, and secondary school pupils had £129 less spent on their education in the same period. These figures include sums for the Pupil Equity Fund. It's quite clear from what COSLA are saying that local government settlement does not include enough for education. So why will the Scottish Government not give councils enough to properly fund education and stop cuts to their schools?
Well, again, it suggests that you're asking me to ring-fence money for education going to local authorities, when in actual fact, we agree an overall settlement and allow local authorities the freedom to determine where that is spent. In terms of funding on resource, the funding includes, as I said, our commitments on the teachers' pay increase and on pensions to ensure that that money is not taken away from the core money that's spent on our classrooms. And it also includes £88 million in terms of supporting local authorities to retain the teacher-pupil ratio. So again, in light of the fact that education, I think, is not just the government's core objective, I think it should be everybody's, and that includes local authorities, we have ensured that the funding settlement to local authorities reflects that. But ultimately, I'm not saying that we have increasingly ring-fenced funding that's going through the local authority settlement to education. we ensure that those costs are included and then give local authorities the freedom to determine how that's spent.
Thank you very much. Angela.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. I've got some questions around poverty and social security. But if I can first turn to affordable housing. You spoke of the £843 million that will be invested to help deliver our commitment around 50,000 affordable homes. As we know, investment in housing contributes to well-being, climate change. It's a big plank in tackling poverty, but it also can help improve the income tax take as well, and I know the Scottish Government have done some modelling around that. Now, if I'm correct, I think we are moving into the last year of the resource planning assumptions for housing for local government, and that's been really important to give local government that longer term certainty. Particularly as the lead-in times to invest and build houses is not inconsiderable. Moving on, if this is the last year of resource planning assumptions for housing, looking ahead to the future, what's next? Because we can't have investment in housing falling off at a cliff edge, given its fundamental importance to tackling poverty and fuel poverty in particular.
Thanks. Well, you're right that there's, again, the £843 million this year as part of the £3 billion package over the 5 years to deliver 50,000 affordable homes. And that does stimulate local economic development and also inclusive growth as well. But in terms of the subsequent years, Homes for Scotland and others have been very clear that in order to manage planning and in order to give that security and certainty to the construction industry beyond 2021, they needed commitments. And so we have committed £300 million in 21-22 to give that certainty to industry to continue bringing forward projects and to ensure that the pipeline of housing doesn't dry up, because I think there was a fear from Homes for Scotland, who of course represent a huge swathe of the industry, that there was a concern that we would have problems this year in terms of delivering that 50,000 homes if there weren't the certainties for subsequent years. So that is included in this year's budget.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm also very interested in the relationship around the choices made and investments that actually lift people out of poverty and some of the other choices we make that actually prevent people from getting poorer. So on the one hand, we've got the very welcome £21 million investment for the forthcoming year for the new Scottish Child Payment. But there's also a raft of investments in so-called mitigation. The bedroom tax, £60 million, 3 times as much as what will be invested this year in the Scottish Child Payment. The Scottish Welfare Fund, I think in the budget is now at £42 million, an increase from last year when that fund was first introduced a number of years ago. I think it stood at £9 million. So how will this budget overall help us meet our statutory obligations, for example, to end child poverty? But how will it help us move forward in actually lifting people out of poverty, in addition to stopping people falling back because of actions elsewhere?
Thanks. Well, as child poverty, or poverty more generally, is one of the 4 main themes, there is quite a significant emphasis on steps both to mitigate poverty and to prevent poverty in the first place throughout the budget. And it is worth saying that we don't look at revenue raising in isolation from how it's spent. We want both the way that we raise tax and the way that we spend taxes to reflect that commitment to reduce poverty in Scotland, and that is why we focus on low-income families in particular. Last year we spent in total about £1.4 billion in support targeted specifically at low-income families, and that included over £100 million targeted at reducing the impact of UK government welfare reforms. And so we've built on that in this year's budget by committing to rollout of the child payments, the first child payments to be made by the end of the year, so there's 21 million towards that in the budget. And there's also other mitigation measures, so we're continuing to invest from the £50 million Tackling Child Poverty Fund. We have increased the Scottish Welfare Fund by over 7%, and again, that's specifically towards mitigating the UK government welfare cut. So it acts as a safety net for people in low incomes to access a crisis grant in an emergency or a disaster, or a community care grant. And then there's also the Scottish Child Payment. That's before I start talking about a number of the other measures around food security, the Fair Food Fund, fuel poverty as well, and a lot of the measures that we're taking around efficiency, energy efficiency, actually tackle challenges around climate change, as well as supporting low-income families too.
Okay, thank you, Minister. And my final question is, we're moving into a really big year for social security, you know, well in excess of £3 billion expenditure, you know, 10% of our resource budget. You'll be familiar with the issues around demand-led budgets, and we've heard evidence about some of the forecasts that will undertaken by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and how no one expects those forecasts to be correct. So my question to you, Minister, is that while the volatility associated with the Scottish budget has increased substantially this coming financial years, the powers to manage this volatility under the Fiscal Framework are, of course, the same as they were in this year and in previous years. So I would be interested to know your view of this, looking forward to the future, what would help you in your job to manage some of this volatility, and whether this is an issue that the Scottish Government has taken up with the UK Government.
Yeah, it is an area of ongoing consideration, as if I were to put it like that. We recognise that the devolution of social security gives us the opportunity to do things differently, but it also means that with managing over £3 billion of social security expenditure, it is going to increase the volatility which the Scottish budget is subject to. And I assume the Scottish Fiscal Commission would have talked about it this morning, but they noted in their publication that it is demand-led, and ultimately it's going to be determined by the number of eligible people that demand it, that needs to be set the rate, and it's a volatility that we have to manage in year. So we'll have to meet that spending as it arises, even if it differs from forecast. Now, even before devolution of social security powers, the levers that we have at our disposal, which are of course borrowing and the reserve, are clearly inadequate to meet the potential level of budget volatility in the current system. And the previous Cabinet Secretary wrote to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to identify that in September, to request an increase in the borrowing and reserve powers in advance of the review of the Fiscal Framework. And I go back to the point that, you know, the very fact that there's a review built into the Fiscal Framework recognises that there was likely to be changes or surprises that emerged, and it would need to be reviewed. Now, I've yet to receive any indication that the UK Government will reconsider the borrowing or the reserve powers to allow us to deal with that volatility. When there is changes at a UK Government level in terms of outturn versus forecasts for tax or for social security spend, then they have got their own borrowing powers to smooth that over, whereas we're severely restricted in the borrowing powers that we have, which don't even take into account something like inflation. And so the question for us is, if you're not going to use the borrowing powers because it's capped, and of course the circumstances in which we can use the borrowing powers are severely restricted. If you're not going to use that, then your alternative is using reserve. But if you're using reserve, then that is money that's not available to invest in all the different areas that we would like to see that funding invested in. So it's an area that has been raised with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. My understanding is that Treasury basically said, when it becomes a problem, come talk to us, which doesn't allow for much guarantee when it comes to managing that level of volatility. But in the meantime, whilst we press for change, at the end of the day, we will have to deal with variance between actual and forecast expenditure in a fiscally responsible way and in line with the principles that were set out in the medium-term financial strategy.
Okay, thank you. Next convener.
Just as a follow-up to Angela Constance's first couple of questions, Minister, you identified in your opening remarks that as well as tackling poverty, well-being was at the core of this year's budget in your view, and certainly the word well-being is used a lot of times in the budget documentation. But can you point to me specific examples of how this new well-being approach, which hasn't been used in previous budgets that your government has introduced into this Parliament, has resulted in shifts in either policy direction or in expenditure? What's not being done now because of well-being that had previously been done by this government?
Yeah, thanks very much. So, two answers to that. The first is it all starts with the National Performance Framework. And that is, of course, the outcomes that we need to be measured against. So at the end of the day, there's indicators built into that. And the budget and the investment decisions and the tax decisions that are taken in the budget have got to reflect the National Performance Framework. Now, where that becomes important is how you look across portfolio areas. So in your scrutiny and in our setting of the budget, too often we just fixate on specific lines. So take the transport line, take active travel, for example, that's seen as a transport line. But actually it's a health line, it's a justice line. There's, it affects
It's a local government line.
What was that?
It's a local government line too.
It's a local government line. And what has always been difficult, and is difficult, I think, for governments around the world, although many are looking at it, not least New Zealand, Iceland, and most recently Canada, is how you capture the impact across portfolio lines, ultimately on an outcome like, happier people with healthier lives. And so I think the starting point to your question, or to answer your question, is that we take the National Performance Framework and we apply that to the decisions that we take around the budget, so that we can capture where a line has an impact on more than just one line. That's
Okay,
first
so
as in.
that's fine as a generality, but can you give me an example of a specific policy direction that's changed, or a specific expenditure line that has moved because of this refocus?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier the interaction between the public sector pay policy and taxation, for example. So the decisions that we've taken, take the public sector pay policy. Public sector pay policy is designed to support lower incomes, so it ensures that there's an underpin at the lower levels, and then there is a cap. There's a 3% uplift until the 80,000 mark, and then there's a cap beyond that of 2,000. Now, that is specifically designed in order to support low-income families and people in Scotland. And that decision is taken not just right across the board to say, we'll cap it at 3% increase. It's specifically designed to further our ambition of making sure that we're protecting lower income people, which I think directly goes somewhere in terms of supporting the well-being budget to support lower income earners and ensure that we are helping to support a healthier, more prosperous, more economically active population.
Okay. Thank you. Gordon, I think you wanted to ask about Barnett consequentials. Just to change the focus a wee bit.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. I wanted to ask, to start off with, you mentioned earlier about discussions with the Treasury sort of pointed to the UK Tory manifesto, but given that this is the first time that the Scottish Government has had to produce a budget prior to the UK budget. What difficulties has that had for the Scottish Government, and what discussions have you had with the Treasury that's been helpful?
So it has all the challenges in it that were identified before the Scottish Government decided to bring forward the budget. And it's worth remembering that the reason that we are going first before the UK Government is in order to provide that certainty to local government and to the wider public sector, because to have waited until after the 11th of March is frankly unthinkable in terms of the pressure that it would have put on local authorities, and also to provide certainty to taxpayers. Our difficulty is that any assumptions that we have built in are based literally on the Conservative Party manifesto, and conversations between officials looking for guarantees have referred us to the Conservative Party manifesto. So there's a lot hanging on taking the Tories at their word. And in the past, we've seen that where announcements have been made, for example, uplift for health, it's only when you see the figures that you know whether that's going to be actually in addition or whether it's going to be net of other areas. So we saw that particularly in health, where there was a commitment around the 600 million, and then it was £50 million lower. So we have engaged on a number of occasions. As I said, I have assumed £142 million of resource budget consequentials and £326 million in capital, and that is drawn from the Conservative Party manifesto costings document for the 2019 election, which contained a detailed breakdown of spending plans, and analysis is set out on in that. So that's been some of the difficulties. I think the other difficulty would be that if there are further consequentials after the 11th of March, now we can do in-year revisions, but by that point we still have to have got through stage 3 of the budget, because stage 3 is on the 5th of March, that's almost a week before the 11th of March, obviously. We need to pass a budget at that point. The consequences of not passing a budget, which are set out on Thursday, are quite catastrophic in terms of social security in particular, because the devolution settlement doesn't allow the flexibility for managing that additional £3 billion of social security spend. So the implications are quite significant. So we can't wait around until the 11th of March to see if there's any more money. So even 2 days ago, there was an announcement I saw around, spending on buses. Well, that's all very well, but A, will it be in this year's budget? And actually the press release referred to a spending review, so that won't be on the 11th of March. And secondly, what are the consequentials for us? We don't know what the consequentials are. You can't build a budget on money you've not had yet. Not just money you've not had yet, but money that's not actually been confirmed and signed off. So that's the area and levels of uncertainty we're in. So when I say I've deployed every penny on the face of the budget, I've deployed every penny on the face of the budget because we've deployed every penny that we know might potentially be coming our way. And then there's the £100 million in reserve.
You talked about the fact that you've had to depend on the Tory party manifesto, and we were told that austerity was over, but the Prime Minister and the Chancellor wrote a joint letter in the last couple of weeks to all UK government departments looking for cuts of up to 5% apart from the health budget. And I'm just wondering if you were able to factor in any of this.
Well, what we factored in is the commitment that's been made by the government and other parties to pass on any consequentials from health to health. Once you do that, the point remains that it's a real terms cut in the budget. So cash increase, real terms cut. And there's no getting away from that. So we have tried to mitigate the impact. As I said, austerity seems to have been a long time coming in terms of any bonuses. You can't call it a bonus if it's just undoing a decade of cuts, or at least trying to undo a decade of cuts. So after uplifts to health, local government and social security, the funding available means that there's a continuing squeeze on other portfolio areas.
And my final question is, you touched upon this earlier, but you know, if there was to be a large divergence from what was in the UK Tory manifesto, how do you cope with that?
Well, it's challenging. We've got some options we can revisit in terms of in-year revisions to the budget, in terms of the budget revision process. So there's a process there, but we won't be able to factor anything into our spending plans in advance of the 11th of March. We work to the SFC's forecasts, so the assumptions that underpin their forecasts are the assumptions that I've just identified in terms of consequentials available. That is the budget we have available to us. Anything after the 11th of March will have to be revisited through the normal process.
Okay, thanks very much.
Minister, you said that you can't build a budget on money that you don't have yet, but in a sense you are inevitably, I suppose, having to do that this time round. And moreover, you're inviting Parliament, aren't you, to approve a budget that is based on not just on Barnett consequentials, but on anticipated Barnett consequentials, anticipated, as you've many times made clear, on the basis of a party manifesto. Has that happened before? And have you had any advice that you can share with the committee about the legality and the propriety of inviting this Parliament formally to approve a budget based on anticipated consequentials of spending, as you rather graphically put it, on money that you don't have?
I mean, there's no getting away from the challenge that this is in terms of whether it's been done before. Assuming it's not been done before, unless anybody else can enlighten me. And that's the fundamental difference between the Welsh Assembly, for example, and our budget, is the additional powers and the levels of volatility associated with those powers. So we've taken a prudent approach in terms of looking at the evidence before us around what might be available and choosing to invest that as far as we can. We believe, and I know that I'm under pressure from all parties inside the chamber and outside the chamber, to invest well, to invest in our public services, to take the right decisions around taxation. But I've got to do that in light of the evidence. And the evidence ultimately now boils down to whether or not the UK government will come true on the promises they made in the election. And our budget depends on that.
And you've discussed with Treasury officials, or perhaps even with Treasury ministers, the consequences of presenting to this Parliament a budget which is based on anticipated Barnett consequentials.
I mean, our position, in a sense, has been dismissed because the case has been made use the OBR figures and the block grant adjustments that were confirmed in December, based ultimately on last March. So the guarantees that we've had are very, very slim and very, very shallow. And there have been interaction with officials at various levels with Treasury, and they consistently refer us to the Conservative Party election manifesto. So we have drawn our assumptions on additional consequentials from that document. I don't know if officials have anything to add in terms of the discussions that we've had.
Yeah, so I mean a couple of additional points. So you're right to say that it is quite an exceptional set of circumstances, specifically around the proximity to a future UK budget and Barnett consequentials. I guess the point I would make is that any budget we do is based on a whole range of different assumptions of different sizes and scales. So, for example, there's a whole set of forecasts that underpin the income levels within our budget, to do with our tax powers, non-domestic rates, and so on. So any uncertainty around the Barnett consequentials figure needs to be put into the perspective of the wider budget and the whole set of things that go into that. A couple of other points in relation to precedent. So previous budgets, we have allocated money based on anticipated transfers that are not in the base budget. That's been done before. And I guess that maybe the third point around the way we've handled the consequentials. So the Minister's correct. We've engaged with Treasury officials who've been very positive and constructive, but have made the point to us that, as with any budget, the final outcome for the devolved administrations is based on the whole budget being put together down south. Only then do we get the net effect for us in terms of consequentials. So we've been guided to the fact that there's no existing alternative really practically to the manifesto. The last point I'd make is that if you look at the way we've judged the resource and capital numbers, on the resource side, we feel we've been pretty pragmatic around that. The majority of the consequentials that we've allocated relate to health, degree of certainty around that, one could argue. And on the capital side, again, we've taken a pragmatic approach, taking into account the overall long-term commitment the UK government's made to infrastructure investment over the piece. So we've done all we can really to mitigate that level of uncertainty in setting the numbers out. As the Minister says, until we see the colour of the budget on the 11th of March, that uncertainty will continue.
Okay, thank you. One more question on this before I move to Tom, Arthur, Sarah.
So it's really about what the process is thereafter. How long will it take you to come to that conclusion about what the impact is, whether you need new budget lines? How will you report back to the Scottish Parliament so that there can be transparency and accountability in those decisions?
So there is a process already, because I've been in front of the committee twice a year, as it were, for the budget revisions. You've got the autumn budget revisions and the spring budget revisions, where we come before Parliament and before the committee for the purpose of scrutiny of the changes that are being made to the budget. And so that will be the process. It's very difficult to answer that question without knowing what the magnitude is. So I would assume that it would be in line with changes that would ordinarily go through the autumn and the spring budget revisions, and that would be a process of coming before Parliament. Where it's quite critical, though, is in terms of discussions with other parties too, in advance of the 5th of March to get the budget through. We cannot discuss money that's not there. In the past, there have sometimes been late consequentials as a result of the UK government's budget, because the UK government's budget has gone before the Scottish government's budget. We don't have the luxury of that this year.
Thanks. Thank you, Tom. I think you wanted to ask about the fiscal framework.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, good afternoon, even Minister. I think much of my line of questioning has already been covered, but I just would be interested to hear your thoughts, Minister, if you'd be willing to expand on what themes you think will inform the upcoming review of the fiscal framework in light of the experiences of setting this budget.
So in terms of the fiscal framework, we have written to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury previously, in September, I believe, identifying the areas that we would like the review to focus on. And that has largely looked at how we smooth volatility. So as I mentioned already, we have got very, very tight borrowing powers. They're very constrained with how we can borrow, when we can borrow, and how much we can borrow. And those thresholds, as it were, don't even reflect inflation. So that's our difficulty, that at the beginning of having more powers over social security, when perhaps the data still needs to be built and developed by those that are responsible for forecasting to be as accurate as possible, and that will be an ongoing iterative process to improve. We have got levels of volatility that we need to manage. And at UK government level, when there is that volatility, which sometimes can go into the billions, they've got substantial borrowing powers to smooth it over. We don't have those powers. So I think it's a recognition of how that volatility disproportionately impacts our budget and what tools we have available. Because at the end of the day, if you cannot smooth volatility through borrowing powers, you've got to smooth it with a resource that could otherwise be spent on our on dealing with child poverty, on building an inclusive economy, and all those other areas. So those are the core issue around the lack of flexibility on borrowing powers to smooth the volatility.
one of the key values underpinning the Scottish approach to social security is to see it as a long-term strategic investment in our people. Do you think there may be a case, if not immediately in the future, for the fiscal framework in terms of borrowing powers reflecting that, giving it the existing powers that are about managing volatility, rather than seeing social security as that long-term investment where the economy and society would over the longer term see a return on that investment?
I think absolutely, because when it comes to borrowing to smooth volatility frees up resource to be invested in those long-term ambitions. And that's what we want to see when it comes to our infrastructure spend as well as our resource spend. We want those long-term outcomes to be realised that are captured in the National Performance Framework. But that can only be done by using the resources that you have as widely as possible and investing wisely. I'd far rather be investing in measures designed to tackle poverty than measures designed to deal with forecast errors, although that's clearly important and needs to be factored in. But those forecasts are independently done, and as a government, whilst we recognise the importance of them, we want the freedom and the flexibility to invest in the things that really matter to the people in Scotland, and I think really matter to members of the Parliament and indeed this committee.
If I may, with your permission, can I ask a brief supplementary to an issue you raised earlier on in the session, Minister, and that was around the potential for the digital economy vis-à-vis productivity. We know that the key underlying reason for variation in growth between the rest of the UK and Scotland is ultimately demographic and population. The SFC effectively confirmed that. They also stated that productivity and low productivity means a challenge across the UK. What opportunities are there through investment in the digital economy to help address those issues around productivity?
Well, I frequently say that the digital economy is the most important area of government, but I think every one of my colleagues would dispute that. But I think it goes right to the heart of our challenges around productivity, because, and I heard a little bit of the evidence given by the SFC this morning, there isn't a magic solution when it comes to productivity. And actually, if you look at the SFC's report, they identify long-term trends from about 2004 when it comes to difficulties around productivity that's facing countries around the world. But at the end of the day, if we don't have the powers that we would like to have to increase our population, although we will continue to use the powers that we do have to make Scotland an attractive place to live, work and invest, then we need to support every individual and every business in Scotland to use the resources, the digital resources that are available to them. And that's what, as part of my own portfolio around data-driven innovation, using data better, using emerging technologies better around AI and automation, and supporting our workforce to transition through the digital economy to make sure that we are, continue to be the highest skilled workforce, and to ensure that people have the skills that they need to manage the new opportunities that come through digital. I think that's one of many ways to tackle productivity. But I think it's worth saying too that we build on strong foundations. There's been a number of announcements in the last few weeks alone about international companies are opening new tech hubs in Scotland, in Glasgow and Edinburgh, because they recognise the digitally skilled workforce that exists here. And I think that will mean that our productivity growth continues to increase.
Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. The speech you made presenting the budget to Parliament had a huge amount of content on climate, on a response to the climate emergency, and I'd like to explore whether the substance of the budget matches up to some of what was in the speech. SPICE analysis of the total budget shows that in 2018-19 there was a substantial reduction in the carbon intensity of the Scottish budget. There was a further reduction in 2019-20, and this year's budget, the 2020-2021 budget, increases again. The carbon intensity is higher than either of those 2 years. Can you tell us the reason for that and why we should welcome it?
So I think we should welcome the budget because it does see a significant step change in terms of the amount of money that's being invested in low carbon infrastructure, going up by 500 million to 1.8 billion overall. But in terms of emissions, that is almost entirely because of the EU cap payments and UK social security payments, which have moved over to the Scottish budget in that time frame. So as a result, the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with Scottish Government spending has also increased. So by removing the spending previously funded by the EU and the social security programmes previously funded by the UK Government, it's possible to arrive at an estimate that is broadly comparable with last year's budget. So yeah, they're broadly in line if you apply this year's updated model to last year's published budget. But I'd be happy to provide that in writing in terms of the figures and how I've arrived at that position.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. In particular, you mentioned just in that answer the 1.8 billion claim on low carbon infrastructure. That was included in the speech last week as well. We asked Parliament's researchers if they had a breakdown of that. They didn't, so they asked the government, and they were told that the person who knew the answer was on holiday. Do you know the answer? What's the breakdown to that £1.8 billion figure?
Well, I can certainly tackle some of it, but that's going to take quite a while to get through the entirety of the 1.8 billion. And I mean, I can go through in answer partially to what some of it includes. So it includes, for example, the investment in heat transition deal, 120 million. It includes 50 million heat networks early adopter challenge, 83 million future transport fund.
I do have some of these specifics already, but in terms of an overall breakdown of the 1.8 billion,
Okay.
Can that be provided in writing to the
Yeah, I
committee?
mean, it's probably easier than me going through every line of the budget right now, as fun as that would be.
That would be helpful. It's obviously a very substantial sum of money, but we would like to know how that breaks down. You mentioned the cap payments, and obviously rural economy is one of the most carbon intensive areas of the budget. The next, though, is transport, transport infrastructure and connectivity. And I'd like to quote from you again, Spice Analysis. It says future funding for infrastructure to support rail routes, bus services, electric vehicles, walking and cycling remain dwarfed by the commitment to invest £6 billion over the next 10 years in during the A9 and A96 trunk roads alongside other trunk road improvement projects such as the Sheriff Hall roundabout, flyover and A7 Maple bypass. Significant investment in major road projects has been found to generate induced demand, and this investment may simply create additional trips by car, as appears to have happened with the Queensferry Crossing. It also generates significant emissions during construction and locks in higher emission travel choices for years to come. And they conclude the significant trunk road investment appears at odds with the Infrastructure Commission's recommendation that no net additional capacity for private cars be added to the road network, and that action needs to be taken to manage demand for road transport. It is also difficult to see how it is compatible with the climate commitments in the new National Transport Strategy. Your response to that?
Well, we will publish the National Transport Strategy, and in the same way that our budget reflects our commitments around climate change, so also will our decisions around infrastructure. I recognise Patrick Harvey's position when it comes to significant infrastructure spend on roads, for example. I think that that's not the only way to transition and to deal with our carbon emissions. I think also creating the conditions to phase out, for example, the need for petrol and diesel cars from the public sector fleet and ultimately from the private sector, and all remaining petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030 is quite an ambitious target which we intend on meeting. So when it comes to managing transport, I think it's simplistic to just say cut all the road projects, particularly when some of them have got a lot more to do with safety and security than anything else. And in that light, I'm thinking of the E9 dualling.
Well, the Infrastructure Commission's recommendation, of course, wasn't about not spending on safety. It was about not spending on increasing the overall capacity. Can you give me an example, any example, of transport spending which has been reduced, or a project which has been decided not to proceed with as a response to the climate emergency?
I can think of ambitions to shift behaviour and shift our focus. And again, A9 dualling, creating an electric superhighway, is an obvious example in that case, where we have chosen to invest in low carbon infrastructure right up and down the A9 to ensure that any measures that are taken when it comes to dualling it, which again have a lot to do with safety and security, also reflect our ambitions on climate change.
We'll only know after the fact, as we did with the Queensferry crossing, whether an investment actually increases road traffic levels. I was asking whether there is an example of anything that has not been proceeded with, or were you spending less as a response to the climate emergency?
Well, in terms of our commitments this year, the increase of 500 million to 1.8 billion pounds, you can only do that if you are looking for efficiencies elsewhere. So our commitment to invest more in low carbon infrastructure projects is a direct result of us choosing and making choices, many of which are, over the weeks in advance of the budget, are discussed and weighed up at length, and a decision to invest in low carbon infrastructure.
It does sound like more of everything. Can you identify any part of the budget which is intended to achieve demand reduction for road traffic, for road transport, as the Infrastructure Commission recommended?
Increase in active travel. Budget.
It's been, the previous 2 years of cuts have been reversed. It's back to where it was about 3 or 4 years ago.
So we've increased that budget.
As you said a few moments ago, you can't call something a bonus if it's simply reversing previous year's cuts.
But I mean, you asked for an example, and I've given you an example of where we've increased spend.
And by what proportion do you estimate that will reduce road traffic demand?
Well, that goes right to the heart of the questions around methodology, around how you measure the entire impact of the budget on carbon emissions, but also ultimately on our commitments when it comes to the climate change plan. I'll be in front of the ECCLR committee next week, looking at and talking about how you measure the impact of the budget. And I know that we made a commitment to improve that methodology, which will be rolled out for next year's budget at the request of those who wanted to ensure that the methodology was robust.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to be persistent on this, but we are all aware that transport is one of the areas where we need this most clear change of direction. Transport emissions have been going up, not down. So we're not going to be taking seriously rhetoric like a climate emergency unless we see significant change. Is there anything in the budget, for example, which will begin to reverse the 40 years of consistent increase in the real terms price of public transport, while owning and using a car has stayed the same or got more affordable in real terms?
83 million on our Future Transport Fund, which is investing in low emission and electric buses, freight facilities, and expanding electric vehicle charging
How will that reduce the price of public transport?
Well, I think that if there's more reliable public transport services, then there'll be a reduction. If you get more freight off lorries and into rail, then that will also reduce emissions.
I didn't ask about emissions. I asked about the price of public transport. What will be done, for example, to cut bus fares? Is there anything in the budget that will achieve that kind of change to the prices that people pay?
Well, we're maintaining the concessionary travel scheme, and we're also investing in the rollout of...
Maintaining.
What was that?
Maintaining still sounds like business as usual rather than an emergency response.
I don't think there's any way you can look at that budget and suggest that we're maintaining what we're doing.
It's the word you just used.
There's no way that you can look at that budget and suggest that we're maintaining our spend. We have consciously chosen to shift resource into low carbon infrastructure, and I think the 1.8 billion is a significant headline figure.
Well, there's one more question, and then we must move on.
Well, I mean, I was simply going to ask if there was anything that would actually reduce, for example, bus fares, and whether the Scottish Government has looked at the proposals that have come, not just from within Parliament, but from outside Parliament, to cut bus fares for young people as one step in the right direction. That's an easy, affordable, and I suspect it would be a popular move that would not only make it easier for young people, for example, to get to college or to work, but would cut the costs of families choosing to use public transport instead of a car.
So it's obviously an issue as well that's been raised by the Labour Party. It's an issue it's an area that we're willing to look at. As I said on Thursday, it's an area that I'd like to see the costings for in particular, because whilst in this year's budget we've increased overall funding for rail and bus services, which includes supporting the National Concessionary Travel Scheme, if there are other proposals, such as expanding concessionary travel to those aged 20 and under, which I understand is one of the areas that the Labour Party have identified, then I'm very happy to look at it. But my question would be around how much it costs and where the Labour Party on that particular area would propose finding the money.
There's a fine line between budget scrutiny and budget negotiations, and I fear we may just be crossing it. With that in mind, Murdo.
Thank you, Convener. You said, Minister, earlier on in the session you were looking forward to constructive working with opposition parties to try and reach agreement on the budget, which of course needs to get a majority to get through Parliament. You also said at least twice in the last hour and a half that every penny had been accounted for in your budget, and that echoed something that was in the statement you gave to Parliament last Thursday. That is a form of words that will be very familiar to members of this committee, because it was used on at least 3 previous occasions by the Finance Secretary, Derek Mackay, when he was sitting in the seat you're sitting in now at this stage in the budget process. And I think it's fair to say, the committee members got into playing a bit of a game with Mr Mackay, because Mr Mackay would come along and say every penny was accounted for, and we would press him on how much money there was down the back of the sofa, and he would assure us not a single penny was there to be found that was not in the budget. And then, lo and behold, just some 3 weeks later or less, we would get to stage 1 of the budget debate, and as if by magic, he would produce out of the either vast sums, 100 million extra, 120 million extra, sometimes more, that were not revealed to this committee at the time he was sitting in the seat that you're sitting in. Now, I know you delivered this budget to Parliament on Thursday, but of course, all the work setting up this budget was done by Derek Mackay, so it's very much his budget, and it would be a remarkable departure from form on his part had he not done what he'd done on all 3 previous occasions, which is produce us a budget, assure us every penny was accounted for, but at the same time be keeping a little bit back in reserve for his budget discussions. So, in the spirit of goodwill and constructive working, and to help all the opposition parties, why don't you just tell us how much money you've got squirreled away, so we can then all have a proper grown-up constructive discussion about the budget?
So I think the member does have to factor in this year that we are working in unprecedented circumstances, and on 2 fronts. One, it's the first year of reconciliations, and 2, it's we don't have all the consequentials agreed. Some of them are anticipated, not guaranteed. And in light of that, I can say unequivocally that every penny is deployed, including the 100 million in reserve. We took a judgment on that 100 million in reserve to ensure that we were maximising the resources available to us to invest, whilst at the same time maintaining a buffer. But in light of the fact that we have anticipated consequentials which are fully allocated within the budget, there is no more resource. Last year, it is worth noting that last year there was late consequentials announced. If the UK government wants to announce some consequentials right now, I could answer your question in a more informed way. But as it is, every penny is deployed. And that's why my position is that where there are spending requests, spending increase requests, then they've got to come from somewhere else.
Thank you. Time will tell.
You mentioned, Minister, reconciliations there, and some final questions from me about the detail of the process around that. So in May, we were told by the SFC that negative income tax reconciliations of around £1 billion were forecast, and that these would need to be dealt with in the next 3 budgets. And we now have audited outturn data for 2017-18 and substantial published outturn data for 2018-19, which the SFC told us earlier this morning is very unlikely to change. And the figure is still around £1 billion. So do you accept now, Minister, that this figure is unlikely significantly to change?
Well, that's a question for the forecasters, to be honest. But the question for us is how we deal with reconciliations.
Indeed.
And, you know, in terms of the decisions that we've taken this year, we have used the levers that we have at our disposal to manage the reconciliation this year. We recognise that reconciliations are part and parcel of the fiscal framework. They don't relate to the relative performance of revenues in the 2 countries. That's a quote from the SFC. And, you know, due to historic forecast error for such a large tax, 3 years of negative reconciliations should, and I quote from them, not be unexpected. That's our position. We'll use the resources that we have available to us. Again, it demonstrates the weaknesses of the fiscal framework in using the levers around borrowing, but we will have to take a judgment at every budget to manage those reconciliations.
Picking up directly on that, in the medium-term financial strategy published by your government in May last year, it states that, that you aimed to build up the balance in the Scotland Reserve over time as resources allow, in order to have a financial cushion available, and that this approach is intended to keep the economic cost of revenue-funded investment and resource borrowing as low as possible to achieve value for money. So why then is the priority in this budget to use resource borrowing to pay for negative income tax reconciliations rather than employing the Scotland Reserve?
Because the question there is, if we were to build up a reserve, a significant reserve, there would be lots of accusations that we are not using our resources as well as we could to invest
so
in
it's
the public.
political, not economic?
Well, I think there's a judgment to be made in terms of the reserves. We have determined that maintaining a buffer of 100 million is fair because it allows us to invest in the areas that people call for us to invest in, whilst taking the prudent judgment to ensure that there is a bit of a buffer. And that is why we have chosen to use our borrowing powers this year to smooth that volatility and to support the reconciliation, 207 million used in borrowing, to ensure that it doesn't take away from the money that is being invested. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to reconciliation and reserves.
I think the important point here is that the fiscal framework provides for a certain amount of money to recognise the issue of forecast error, and that's what is being deployed this coming year as appropriate. The Scottish Fiscal Commission has set out its estimates for the level of likely forecast error for the next couple of years for income tax, and you can see that they are also sizable. Over the long term, however, a forecaster with the kind of experience that the SFC and the OBR have would expect to see that forecast error net out to 0, the long term for economists being about 20 to 25 years. Okay. So whilst we are currently seeing a run of negative reconciliations, there will be periods of time when we see runs of positive reconciliations. We just haven't got there yet.
But I think what we're interested in, specifically on this question, is whether the approach that you have now in the budget, Minister, has changed from the medium-term financial strategy, or whether, in your estimation, the approach that you set out in the budget is a reflection of the policy set out in the medium-term financial strategy.
The approach taken in the budget builds on the medium-term financial strategy, and
that's a very interesting answer. Builds on. Is that a change of approach, or is it the same approach?
I mean, I think it's I don't think there's any big differences. The approach in the medium-term financial strategy, with the forecast that we had available to us, the approach that we chose to take. I mean, this budget reflects the themes in the medium-term financial strategy. There's not been a significant policy change in that time, but officials have been more involved in the medium-term financial strategy process to this point than I have. So
I mean, so two additional points on borrowing. So firstly, in terms of the question about the distinction between drawing on the resource borrowing powers or using the reserve, as the committee knows, the discretion we have over how to use resource borrowing is quite limited, and one of the key purposes of resource borrowing under the fiscal framework is to tackle the issue of reconciliations, whereas the reserve gives us a wider suite of things that we can do with that level of resource. So there's a judgment to be reached about how you use these different tools, and the judgment reached was to use the resource borrowing to tackle the reconciliations. In terms of the medium-term financial strategy, one of the judgments we've reached in this budget is around capital borrowing, where the decision was taken that in light of a number of pressures in terms of the economy, the impact of EU exit, and the case for additional investment on the back of that, coupled with the shift towards an increased investment in low-carbon infrastructure, there was a strong case for looking again at that capital borrowing plan. So those are maybe two examples of the judgments we've reached in the budget.
Okay, thank you. Last question, Neil.
Thanks, Convener. Clearly, we need to grow the Scottish economy, and the Scottish Government and yourself, Minister, have talked about prioritising inclusive growth, and you talked about measures to get talked about the measures being taken to get people back into work this morning. My concern is that the rhetoric doesn't quite meet reality in terms of those statements. The reason I say that is because despite the Scottish Government's budget increasing, the line for employability and training has had a 0.4% real terms cut. And within that, the employability and workforce skills budget that includes programmes like local employability model, employability fund, the Discovering Your Potential fund aimed at reducing inequality by targeting care experienced young people into the labour market, the disability employment gap, and other areas such as PACE. That budget has been cut in cash terms by 2.5% and would obviously be a greater cut when taking into account inflation in terms of real terms. Can you tell us why that is, Minister, and could you provide the committee, perhaps in writing, with a breakdown on the impact the budget will have on each of the components within that budget line?
Thanks, and I'm happy to follow up with more information in writing. In terms of the decisions that are made, again, around this year's budget, so our commitment is to invest through our enterprise agencies and other funds. I mentioned some of them already this morning. In terms of every year looking at new ways in order to support the workforce into work and to ensure that our economy is thriving and doing well, particularly at a time with low unemployment and the more significant challenges around inactivity, we want to ensure that all of our spending decisions are maximising the opportunities available to people. So it stands to reason that in a year where, for example, the Scottish National Investment Bank is increasing in terms of its resource, when a number of the other funds I mentioned already this morning, which I can go into detail again, is ensuring that they are continuing to support people into work, then it stands to reason that we look at it in the round to make sure that the outcome and the impact is more significant than the inputs.
Thank the Minister for that answer and look forward to that information. Would you not accept, though, Minister, it does seem counterintuitive when employment levels are 2% lower than the rest of the UK that we are cutting, or the Scottish Government is cutting employability budgets?
Well, I don't accept that we are cutting budgets to support people into work. And I also don't think that you can look at those specific lines in isolation of everything else that we're doing to support people into work, including real terms increases for higher and further education as another example of where we are supporting the skills base to ensure that the workforce is thriving and has the skills needed to face the challenges of the future. But I mean, I think I picked up this morning that you had a discussion with the SFC as well in terms of that difference between employment and unemployment. And I don't know if Lucy had a point to make on that.
Yes, a discussion that you had with the SFC this morning around the employment levels in Scotland relative to those of the UK are explained by a higher rate of inactivity in Scotland. And that is caused by two factors. One is at the lower age end of the workforce, to do with people being still in education and training, which could be seen as a positive because it provides the skilled workforce for the future. And at the older end of the workforce, 55 and above, there is and has been a fairly long-standing issue in Scotland of older workers leaving the workforce earlier, in part because of health issues. And I think what that illustrates is that the employment story for Scotland is about education, skills and training, but it's also related to the health budget and the work that is done there. And finally, I'd observe that tackling these issues is a long-term project.
So I guess all that's to say that every budget, we don't choose to just continue budget lines for the sake of it. Ultimately, we want to ensure that those budget lines are dealing with the core challenges and are improving the outcomes. The outcomes are the National Performance Framework outcomes. We want to make sure that our resource is fully maximised to actually deliver better outcomes, not just to protect budget lines.
But just to clarify, you will provide a breakdown of those,
I'll take that away.
How it's impacting employability budgets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Minister and her officials for their evidence this morning, and I close this meeting.